Sure. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks brief so that there's lots of opportunities for questions. This is a very odd topic because I ended up very much in the middle of it, pretty much by accident, in all sorts of really weird and very strange ways. I can talk about probably about 2/3 or so of the experience that I've had. There's a bunch of stuff which is still quite sensitive, so I can't talk to everything that's gone on. But it's such a fascinating, really weird topic that I've sort of been in the middle of, and it's very sort of interesting. So I'll just sort of walk through what's basically happened sort of to date. So basically what happened was in June 14th last year, there was a very interesting news story that came out, which was in the Washington Post. And it basically said the DNC had been hacked, right? And they had been hacked by the Russian government. And my immediate view on this, I work in cybersecurity, companies get hacked all the time, was I thought this was a very clever framing by the DNC, right? This is a company, which is a private sector organization, they've been hacked. The best thing to do when you've been hacked is to find someone really sophisticated that hacked you so it wasn't your fault that you got hacked, right? And so it seemed to me like this was a very clever framing by them. But in the event that you're the Russian government, the DNC is a completely legitimate target, right? If the NSA wants to hack, Russian political parties, I would have no problem with that. I can't really object when the tables are turned, right? So, when the Russian government is hacking the DNC, they're really interested in who is this Hillary Clinton person, who are all the people around her. There's a good chance she's going to become the president. Who does she really listen to on national security matters? Who does she really listen to on foreign policy matters? Can we discredit some of the people that are very anti-Russian? Can we manage to, encourage her to look at people that are very pro-Russia? This seems to me like fairly standard intelligence work, and they got caught, right? And so, along comes this cybersecurity firm. They say the DNC was hacked. They were hacked by Russia. And my view was, wow, that's really boring, right? This is just life as normal. And also, there was no evidence on the first day that there was the Russian government involved, and lots of people like to come up with very bold reasons as to why, certain individuals were involved versus others, and so it just seemed to me like this was a very good framing by the DNC. And so I sort of thought nothing more of it. And then something crazy happened, which was the next day, someone appeared online, they called themselves Guccifer 2, and they said, I was the one that hacked the DNC, right? And this suddenly was really interesting because the original hack, someone was targeting political information in one of the major, campaigns for, President of the United States. There's a whole ton of countries that could hack the DNC and would be very interested, from, the Russian government to, the Israeli government to the Chinese government. There's loads of countries who would be really interested in that information. But then to come out suddenly and say, oh, actually, no, it wasn't, this Russian government that all these cybersecurity professionals are talking about. It was me, some random, hacker who's just on the internet, trying really aggressively to try and discredit this initial attribution. That was something that most countries, they're not going to be involved in, right? If you get caught hacking, you sort of back away and hope that this sort of blows over. With this particular case, there was suddenly this individual claiming to be Guccifer 2 who was very, very sure that this was not the Russian government. And he had all of this information, and he was starting to publish it in order to prove that he had hacked the DNC. And this was really interesting, because if you follow intelligence studies, there's very few countries that go down this sort of active measures route of trying to influence the opinion of the public with regards to this particular thing. And so when you look through who are the countries that really do this, the number one that comes out is the Soviet Union, right? This is classic 1960s, 1970s Soviet Union active information operations, right? And so it was sort of really obvious, hey, maybe this, claim by the Washington Post, maybe first of all, it's got a lot to it that we now need to sort of dig in. We now need to have a look at the malware to see what's actually gone on. But thirdly, this is now something quite different. This is no longer political espionage to form foreign policy. Now they're trying to sort of influence political discourse in the United States. And my initial view is that they're trying to do this because they got caught, and they're really embarrassed that they got caught, and they're really just trying to, kick up a whole ton of sand to change everyone's view. The Washington Post, Hillary Clinton, all of these people are saying this is the Russian government. We're going to kick up a whole ton of sand. No one will know who it was, and then life can go back to normal, right? And I saw this happen. I was based in the UK at the time, and this seemed to me like it was really interesting because this had happened so quickly, right? The story had come out. Less than 24 hours later, someone had arrived with a new website, with a new Twitter account, with a whole ton of documents. They were publishing this really quickly to discredit this news story. And if any of you have ever worked in government, one of the number one things that you learn about governments is that they're not very good at working quickly and well, right? They can work either quickly and not well, or they can work well and not quickly. In the event that they're working very quickly, there's a good chance that they've screwed up. And so working in cybersecurity, my initial thing was, hey, there's a whole ton of really cool documents, right? These documents are going to be interesting to read. But also, this is a really interesting hack. It's suddenly much more interesting than normal hacks. But they've probably screwed up. Let's just have a look at whether or not there's leaked bits of information in here that tell us how the DNC was hacked. Maybe it's going to tell us where inside their organization they were hacked. Maybe it's going to tell us the individuals that were hacked. Maybe it's going to tell us they used 0 days versus they did phishing attacks. Maybe it's going to reveal some aspect of who these attackers are. So I just, I have a Twitter account. I thought, I'll just go through this, reasonably late in the evening in the UK. I was just going through it and tweeting out my observations. And one of the things that sort of was quite interesting was they had screwed up. There was a bunch of different ways that they had screwed up. Some of these documents, they had saved them, right? And one of the things about Microsoft Word is that when you save a document, it saves the username of the person that saved it into the document, right? And this is apparently a really useful feature because it means that when someone sends you a document, you can see who it was created by, who it was last modified by. Maybe some of them have track changes so that you can see what's gone on. And my number one concern when I was looking at this is a government that's probably leaking. It's probably the Russian government because this is a very sort of Russian-Soviet type thing. They're releasing a whole ton of documents to influence public opinion. What if they change these documents, right? What if these documents are not the actual documents taken from the DNC network? What if they've added a paragraph somewhere, right? What happens if they've changed some of it? What happens if they've removed some of these paragraphs? That would be really interesting, but there's also a ton of precedent for it, right? This is exactly what the Soviet Union used to do for disinformation operations. There used to be entire documents that were passed off to journalists, which were entirely made up, right? And in order to influence US public opinion. Things like there was claims about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. This was genuinely an operation dreamt up in the Lubyanka building in Moscow. We now have the documents to prove that they invented this enormous fiction that the AIDS pandemic was started by US chemical scientists in the military, right? And this is sort of so classically Russian that my immediate thought was, they must be doing this. It's such a sort of an obvious thing for them to be doing. Let's see if we can prove it, because now we have all of these sort of modern cybersecurity tools for doing forensics. Let's see if we can find it. It turns out we weren't able to find any document changes. We were able to find a whole ton of these cases where they had saved documents wrongly and they had accidentally stored their usernames. And the usernames were in Russian, right? They had just completely screwed up. And they had things like the time zone. Because of course it saves when you last saved it, and the time zones were in Russian, right? And you're like, I wonder which country in GMT +2 has an interest in changing some of these documents, and it was really interesting. And so I just published all of this. I thought, this is this is just, they've screwed up because they've tried too quickly to try and change the narrative. But they rushed, they screwed up. Government agencies that rush screw up, like, big surprise. Isn't this funny? Okay, I can go to bed and life is fine, right? And then something even weirder happened, which was the next day they started publishing more documents, right? And my initial thought was this was crazy that they were going to publish any documents in the first place, right? They were trying to discredit the public narrative that this was the Russian government. But then they had got caught out, and they had been comprehensively caught out. This was an obvious Soviet-style disinformation operation. They had done all of these operational security failures. It was really obvious. The thing you should do now as a government agency is go, wow, that was a dreadful mistake. Let's just stop, put all of our tools down, like, they won this round, like, life will continue as normal. But they didn't do that. They started publishing more documents. And what they started doing was they started publishing more documents where they had deliberately edited lots of this metadata, right? And one of the things that's interesting is the fact that they were editing this metadata meant, first of all, they were reading what other people were writing about it, right? And second of all, they were trying to discredit it. And if they're trying to discredit it, you have to ask, well, why are they trying to discredit it, right? They're trying to discredit this thing, which was trying to discredit that thing. They're just trying to kick up more sand. But actually, what that really makes you think is, well, if they're trying to discredit it, maybe there's something to it. So you start sort of building up this picture of, you know, they're trying to discredit this attribution to Russia. And at this point, they're really not, you know, involved sort of politically. This is, you know, their initial blog post is sort of rants against the Illuminati. It says CrowdStrike is this terrible company, you know, fuck them. You know, it's extremely abusive at the technical researchers that put together this attribution. And it was just a really interesting thing to see that they sort of changed over time. You know, over the first few weeks, it was really about the sort of technical attribution, trying to kick up dust and make it look like it was someone different. And then something really interesting happened, which was in the middle of the campaign, right? This was in the middle of summer. There was a point where this started ratcheting up and it sort of hit the political press in the United States, and people started being very upset that, you know, there was this foreign country who was interfering in the election, and it seemed pretty obvious that it was Russia. And so you ended up with this massive escalation of concerns on both sides, where both people were, you know, saber rattling. And after a while, it just went silent, right? And I thought, okay, they've done the sensible thing. They've realized that this operation has gone really badly wrong for them. They've been completely caught out. They're going to close it all down. That's the end of the story. Life goes on, right? And then what happened was the DNC convention happened. And the DNC convention, or the Democrats' convention, was immediately prefixed by WikiLeaks dumping all of the emails that had been taken from the DNC internal network. And if you had been following this, a couple of weeks earlier, WikiLeaks had been very, very pro-Guccifer 2 and had said, you know, we've got this large number of documents now. And Guccifer 2 starts retweeting this thing, and they say, oh, we've got all of these documents. And in one of the blog posts, Guccifer 2 says, I've given all of the sort of the internal emails to WikiLeaks. And then in the immediate prefix to this DNC convention, suddenly all of these internal DNC emails come out, right, which led to the resignation of Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, if you'll remember. And this was really interesting because up until this point they had been pretty quiet. You know, they had done this initial bit of trying to discredit the attribution, and they had gone quiet. And then suddenly WikiLeaks pushes all of these emails. And everything sort of changes because suddenly they've realized something quite interesting, which is that these emails are really affecting US politics now, right? They've managed to get someone who's very senior inside the Democrat Party to resign over this, right? They've managed to create this enormous amount of press, right? Hillary Clinton's emails saga was, you know, goes back much longer, but the fact that there were all of these Democrat emails, that just reminded everybody of this saga that was going on, which was causing her all sorts of political grief here in the United States. And so it was really fascinating to see them learning over time that actually this information is not just about discrediting the attribution to Russia, but actually shaping the entire of the political media landscape in the United States. There's this enormous conference for the Democrats going on, and none of the TV networks are talking about it because they're all talking about how Debbie Wasserman-Schultz has just resigned and all of the new emails that have come out about it. which is really fascinating. And then a little bit later, you start to see them sort of adapting their techniques, trying to choose who it is that they're attacking. Like they will go after people that are in the news who are making claims against them. They started doing things like much more aggressively targeting people inside the White House. So there was a different group that was operating at the same time as this Guccifer 2 one called DC Leaks. And they were hacking, they were releasing the hacked emails of all sorts of junior administrative officials and all the way up to generals in the United States in order to try and discredit them. And they recognized that every time they did this, they get this enormous media boost for the fact that these emails were private, now they're being leaked. And the media would say, well, if they were private before and now they've been leaked, there must be something to it. And so all the journalists would read it and come up with stories. And it would just drown out all of the rest of the whatever was going on at the time. And you could really just, if you were watching it, you could see them learning over time. It was really fascinating to watch. And then something different happened again in about mid to late, so I think it was very late September, early October, which was that there was this guy called John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. And he had been hacked, but he had actually been hacked back in, I think it was February or March. So actually much before any of this had gone on. He had been hacked using a phishing attack. And WikiLeaks decided that they were going to start publishing his emails. And if you plot it out on a calendar, they did it one every day, like a new tranche every day from about late September through to the election itself, right? There was about 40 or so releases. And what this meant was that everybody got this publication of emails. Journalists would go and have a look inside these emails. Towards the end of it, they were getting bored, but they would say, "Oh, there's some more emails. Obviously, there must be something in here." They would go and read it, and they'd say, "Well, there's not that much in there." But then you've spent some time as a journalist reading through it. You're going to write up what you did. I read a bunch of emails. There was this one. It wasn't very interesting. There was this one. But what this meant was that the media cycle was just completely dominated by emails constantly, which was also the one thing that was causing Hillary Clinton so much campaign grief. And one of the really interesting things as well was looking at it from a cybersecurity perspective. We had to keep on coming back to, well, who is this? How do we know? What are the different breaches? And who was hacked? And initially, we sort of had a lot of evidence that this was an operation that felt very Soviet, but we didn't really have a lot of technical details early on. But over time, we started getting all sorts of really fascinating technical details coming out. So we ended up with the malware that was on the DNC network. I have a copy of it. It's a fairly standard malware, but we can attribute it because the malware that they used has very similar technical characteristics to malware used by, in other breaches. So when we go to other companies, we can look at the malware, we can see if there's similarities. And this particular one was a piece of malware called Xtunnel. It's used for basically exfiltrating files from a network and taking control of computer systems via malware. This is malware that's used all the time against Ukraine. It's used all the time against NATO. It's used all the time against the UK government. It's used all the time against the German government. And it's used all the time against Russian journalists that are critical of the government. And over time, you sort of build up a picture of who might be behind this. Well, you're sort of forced towards some fairly obvious conclusions, right? And the technical evidence sort of builds up over time. And again, you have this problem of big government agencies, they screw up, right? When you're trying to do massive operations at scale, it's hard to keep them secret. And we saw, that from the DNC perspective. We also saw from the John Podesta emails, right? One of the things that came out in the John Podesta emails is he was sent a bunch of phishing emails. It turns out when you publish all of John Podesta's emails, one of those emails is the email that he was sent to try and phish him for his password, right? And it was a very sophisticated email. You can actually reconstruct it exactly. And what it is it's an email that says, "Hi from Google," right? "Someone has logged into your account from Ukraine. You need to click here in order to change your password," right? And it looks completely legit. Like it's completely made up, of course. It's not from Google. We can prove technically that it's not from Google, and it contains this little link, right, which changes your password. And this link, for whatever reason, they decided they were going to shrink using a URL shortener, right? So lots of people know how these link shorteners work. You have things like bit.ly, you have things like tiny.cc, where you have this very long, difficult to remember link, and you shorten it down to something that's much easier. And they did that for the link in order to hide what it was. And so we have that link, and we can ask bit.ly, well, tell me information about this link. And they say, okay, well, first of all, I'm going to tell you where it goes, right? It goes to somewhere that looks like a legit Google URL, but isn't. And it also contains information like his username, it contains information like his email address, it contains information like what his profile picture should be that's displayed on this page, right, in order to steal his password. And you might think, well, if they're phishing him, why do they need to send this information in the link, right? Because if they're only phishing against him, then their phishing server could just know that information. But that's the thing, is that they weren't just phishing him. They were phishing loads of people. And so when they send out these phishing links, they need to communicate from the link to the server who it is that they're attacking, because each individual that they're attacking has a different link. And then when you click on the link, it goes to the phishing server, and the phishing server decodes the link, and it says, this one is John Podesta, so I need to change his name to John Podesta. It's got this particular profile picture, so I'll put in that profile picture, and this is his email address, in order to make a really realistic looking page. But one of the other things that bit.ly was able to give us was it was able to say, well, this was created by a user that also created a bunch of other links, right? You know, this isn't a user who's just created one link. He's a user that's created thousands of links. And whoever it was that set up this account didn't think very carefully about how to set it up securely. They set it up in such a way that all of these links were public, right? So what we did was we said, okay, we know who the user is that created this phishing attack against John Podesta. Tell me all of the other links that were sent there, right? And so we got about 1,800 or so other links from the same user. And because the link contains the username and the email address and the profile picture of who they're attacking, we know who all of those people are, right? And we can say, oh, they attacked this other White House official. We can see that they attacked this person who works in NATO. We can see this person that works in, some of these other organizations. And you can map them out. You can say, well, who are they? What sectors do they work in? And start to piece together. This is not an individual. This is a large operation by someone that is extremely sophisticated, who has this enormous, this was 1,800 links, by the way, in a year, right? So this is not someone who is at home in their bedroom hacking, one or two groups. This is someone that is attacking at scale. This is a collection of individuals. And when you map it out, you start to see some pretty obvious and striking, observations. They're really interested in people that write critically about Russia, right? In any country. They're very interested in national security reporters. They're very interested in members of the Ukrainian parliament, right? They're very interested in NATO. They're surprisingly interested in Chinese businessmen who have business interests in Russia, right? And so you start to get to this point where you're like, whoever sent this email to John Podesta they're sending these emails to a lot of people who all seem to have conspicuous relevance to Russian national security, right? And to Russian foreign intelligence. And so you start over time, we started very initially thinking, this looks and feels a lot like a Russian Soviet type disinformation operation. But much later, we start to have all of these additional pieces of very interesting technical information where you're sort of forced towards this is an enormous group. It's almost certainly Russia. Because if it's not Russia, where is all of the Russian hacks, right? Either Russia has absolutely no hacking operations and there's this other group that's really interested in Russian geopolitics who is doing all of this hacking, or this is the Russian government, right? You're basically forced to one of these two conclusions. And so you end up with this sort of really fascinating interaction of this at the same time as people in the US, sort of trying to understand it, trying to piece it together. And I come at this, of course, you can probably tell by my accent that I'm not an American, right? And my interest in US politics, I find it fascinating, but I'm not political in the US. Like, I genuinely have, friends that are Democrats who are Republicans. I have no real sort of preferences as to who you elect. That's your business. But I was very much interested in this from a very sort of technical, watching it from a distance perspective, and watching also in the US people taking it from a partisan perspective. You had, at the time this was all happening, you had Donald Trump saying, this is definitely not Russia, this is all a big hoax. You had people like Hillary Clinton saying, the Russians are trying to help Donald Trump. And all of these sort of partisan perspectives, from non-technical people who are coming at this from very partisan perspective, it was very interesting to see how they would get important details wrong on both sides. So you would often, initially when I saw lots of these things back in June, my view was that this was not about supporting Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. It wasn't about that. It was about discrediting this attribution early on. And it was only much later that it became sort of overtly pro-Trump. And it was sort of very interesting watching in the US that people assumed that this was always about being pro-Trump or always being about anti-Clinton, and sort of fascinating to watch. And even continuing through to the election of Donald Trump, where in the immediate sort of prefix to the election, we were able to see major Russian escalations sort of pre-positioning for the election outcome, which then they got the wrong outcome. They got an outcome that they didn't expect, and they cancelled all these operations, so it never really became, public what everything was going on. So to give you an example, in the last two blog posts by Gustavity, before he completely vanishes on November 8th, right? The last two things that he does is he says, Hillary Clinton is terrible, she's trying to rig the election. And the very last thing that he does before the election, he says, I'm going to be watching the election from inside the electoral networks, right? He knows how this is being played inside the United States, that this is this sort of rigged election narrative is really coming to the fore. And you can see sort of all of these Russian Twitter bots ramping up really aggressively for Donald Trump is going to lose and we're going to say that the election was rigged, right? And it's all Director Comey's fault for allowing Hillary Clinton off the hook. It's all the Democrats' fault for rigging it against Bernie Sanders. Poor Donald Trump, and life will continue in order to discredit the new US administration. It was fascinating to see all of this ramping up really aggressively in the last week before the election. And on election day, it just about started and then cancelled everything, right? And they cancelled everything because they realized, hey, this election is going in a different direction. We have no idea what's going to happen now. And you genuinely see it, entire Russian Twitter bots, networks just went completely dark overnight. The Guccifer 2 group vanished. Shadow brokers vanished and only briefly came back in January. The DC Leaks website, they didn't bother to renew it. All of these operations, they just completely cancelled because they were terrified as to what have we done? We don't really understand what's going on now. I always find it very interesting that we have a lot of narrative now as to what happened back then, which I don't think fits very well with the facts as we know it. My view is that they really wanted to damage a Hillary Clinton presidency that they expected, and ended up bizarrely in this sort of world where they ended up with Donald Trump. They didn't expect him, and they didn't know what was going to happen off the back of it, and so decided to back off and see what was going to happen in response. And you can really see this even now. They've sort of, coming back, and they've recognized that there are certain topics that cause enormous grief inside the United States. So, for instance, over the past few weeks, big Russian troll armies have been, really going down this, why are all these NFL players kneeling during the US national anthem? How desperately anti-patriotic of them, right? And this is being driven from Moscow, right? they really don't care about the patriotism of NFL players. But they've recognized that this is a big deal in the United States. This causes a lot of partisan grief in the United States, and they recognize that by amplifying some of these stories, they can cause all of this kind of complicated behavior where the United States is now really focused on itself, and it's really not focused on things like what's going on in Ukraine. It's really not focused on what's going on in Syria. It's really not focused on, are we taking credit, or are we, doing stuff in Raqqa, as part of ISIS. They're really not sort of paying very much attention to what are our NATO partners up to. So they've really succeeded in creating these stories and amplifying these stories that cause the United States to not pay attention to what Russia is doing geopolitically. So I'm going to leave it there and have a bit of time for questions. Yep.
So you have several different things. You got DNC hack, you have Vesta hack, DCCC, you have active information campaigns by Twitter bots, Facebook bots. How much of that do you think is, directed, we're to have this piece working with this piece versus, well, they're trying everything and those are the few things that happen to stick?
That's a really great question. One of the things that's really interesting about the way that the Russian intelligence services arrange their operations is that they do have large numbers of different groups. They try stuff aggressively. Lots of stuff doesn't work. So they try it, it doesn't work, they move on, they do other things. They're really good at, basically throwing as much stuff, see what sticks. If it sticks, they'll really sort of needle it in, twist the knife. This is something that they've always done. They're very good at it. They've increasingly discovered that online and social media is a great way of doing this, because the Twitter people that you are interacting with, for the most part, you don't know if they're real people, right? And so they have entire organizations dedicated to setting up these bot armies in order to amplify particular messages that they're interested in. One of the things that you mentioned that's quite interesting is that you do, when you're doing forensics, you do have to be quite careful to separate these individual events, because there's lots of times where some part of it is clearly a Russian government directed effort, some of it you think it might be, but you're not quite sure. And you have to be very careful in your mind as to what do you know versus what are you assuming. And to give you a good example of that, a couple of years ago there was an attack on a French TV station, TV5 Monde. This was by a group called APT28, which is the same group that attacked the DNC. But they did it pretending to be the quote-unquote cyber caliphate, right? In order to drive up tensions inside France. And a lot of people have assumed off the back of it, that is a very strong attribution, we know that very, very strongly, but a lot of people have made bad assumptions off the back of that say the Russian government is behind the cyber caliphate, which is wrong, right? It was that they did this attack and pretended this attack was the cyber caliphate. That doesn't mean that other attacks by the cyber caliphate are the Russian government. And you have to be constantly quite careful when you're doing forensics as to what are the inferences that you're making, are they logically valid? What are the individual components? Some of those components you have very strong evidence for, some of them you have weaker evidence for. Yep.
The influence in the narrative, for instance, the NFL, I read the Washington Post, New York Times, sort of established outlets. How can their hacking influence someone like me? Because what I'm reading, I assume, has been vetted. So it has to be through social media.
Yes.
Otherwise, how else can they get to me when I read an article about the NFL dealing or not? That is a valid story. So how do they get to me?
Oh, for sure. And one of the things that's very important to realize is that a lot of these things, they're not making the stories up. They're quite often they're looking for stories that are divisive, and they're amplifying them in order to amplify the divisiveness, or they're working out how they can try and sort of pivot them in order to be more divisive versus less divisive, right?
Where do these amplifications appear? That's the question.
Yes. So one of the things that in the NFL case, they've sort of recognized that this causes a lot of tensions in the United States, and they're influencing how much attention it gets in the US press. And by amplifying the number of people that read these stories, journalists make the assumption, well, all of these people are reading it, therefore these are good stories to continue to report on. And you end up with lots of people sort of commenting on these stories. Well, some of those comments are clearly by genuine concerned US citizens. Some of them are not. And you end up with, you know, if a genuine sort of concerned US citizen says, actually, I think that it's very disrespectful for people to be kneeling during the anthem. And then all of these Twitter bots can come in and they can say, this is a person I can come in, I can twist a knife, and I can really sort of help drive this division, you know. And it's really quite sort of, it's very easy to think of this in sort of partisan terms, but it's actually very non-partisan. They're really trying to shift both sides away from each other because this causes so many problems, rather than targeting one side versus the other. Yep.
On that, from DHS's again, like with Twitter and some of the other social media, and they have, not DHS, but say Twitter has closed down some of these accounts. Can you speak to that and, you know, privacy versus, you know?
So for sure. So we've definitely seen a very big shift in the mentality of Silicon Valley between pre-election and post-election, and also with the media, to be honest. We've seen a lot of, before the election, there was a lot of people like me, you know, sort of saying these are issues that we need to be quite careful about. We do need to think quite carefully about them. Obviously, we don't want to get to a point where the government is telling you what are good stories to publish versus bad stories to publish. We also don't want to get to a point where you're doing sort of whack-a-mole, you know, I can tell that this one's a bot, therefore I'm going to close this one down. Because what happens if you do that is they learn what metrics you're using, right? So they just get better at hiding. They just burrow down further. And so that used to be the old narrative was, you know, Silicon Valley would say, this is other people's problems. We're pro-free speech. We're not going to get involved in this. This sounds like other people's problems. They can deal with this. We're just a completely content, viewpoint neutral platform. And we've really seen post the election, a lot of people have said, rightly or wrongly, that, you know, their analysis has changed as a consequence of the election. Maybe this was much more of a big deal than they thought it was. And as a consequence of this, they're much more proactive in looking for these things. And I think Facebook's done quite a good job of determining what's relevant, saying, you know, we're shutting these down because they are a foreign government-directed effort to influence US public opinion, and it's the fact that it's foreign government-directed is why we're closing it down, not because we don't like what they're saying. They can say whatever they want. If you're a foreign government and you're doing this to influence US public opinion, it's not welcome on our platform. Yep.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to raise my hand.
Yeah, so I think Twitter in particular has really been quite slow to respond. Yesterday they mentioned that they had closed down about 200 or so accounts, mostly after Facebook had contacted Twitter directly and said these are accounts that are relevant to this thing. I think Congress is now very much more interested in this. There's lots of investigations into what's going on there. I think that the Silicon Valley companies are really responding to the fact that they've been caught off guard. Like, you know, suddenly, in the olden days, right, it was, you know, with Apple versus FBI and those types of things, it was very popular, it was very good marketing to be, you know, the content neutral, we're not interacting with the government can go away, this is a for everyone platform. And really much more recently it's swung the other way. People are saying, hey Twitter, hey Facebook, how is it acceptable that you're accepting $200,000 in order to help swing our election for a foreign government? And I think public opinion is very fickle, and this has caught Silicon Valley off guard.
Thank you.
Yep.
Did your path cross Cambridge Analytica, and did you get a feel for how impactful the other role actually was?
I don't know enough about the Cambridge Analytica side of it, unfortunately. Yep.
So going back to the hacking of different organizations or individuals, is this a development problem where some of these organizations and individuals aren't technologically sophisticated enough to have their stuff secured, or can we always assume that hackers will be one step ahead of whatever technology campaigns and people are using?
So I think there's you're right, there's two separate problems there, right? When it comes to things like John Podesta, right, in the event that he had used two-factor authentication, it would have been a bit harder for them to have taken his credentials. But then the thing to bear in mind there is that, this is one man who is not technical against multi-billion-dollar funded federal agency of the Russian Federation, right? If they really wanted to gain access to his emails, they can, right? They can send him malware, and it doesn't really matter that he didn't have some of these protections. So I think we definitely do need to be thinking about why are we so vulnerable, how can we get ourselves to be less vulnerable in terms of being hacked in the first place. But that's not sufficient, because they're always going to be able to, spend enough in order to be able to gain access. So we also need to think in terms of our defense against these disinformation operations, which might be in terms of deterrence. You might say, in the event that you leak our emails in this format, then we will respond in X format. You don't like that, therefore you won't, right? Sort of traditional deterrence. You could do it in terms of sort of direct penalties. You might try and find extra ways in order to sort of defend the media against it. So France, for instance, says that in the immediate prefix to an election, there's a blackout on election-related media coverage. Whether or not that works in an age with social media is sort of debatable. But I think you're right. These are two different issues, and we do need to tackle them quite separately. Yep.
It seems that there's an analogy to be drawn between like cold and hot wars, and there's the apparent shift in attitude with intelligence agencies towards cybersecurity. And so, for instance, prior to the DNC hack, it seemed to indicate that intelligence agencies were more of, well, we were caught, we were handed the cookie jar, we should back off. Whereas now they're more willing to double down, regardless of, we don't care whether or not you know who's doing this, we just care whether or not it's effective. Is that something that you would say is a change in attitude, or?
Yes and no. Governments have been hacking for a very long time for sort of traditional espionage. I think the earliest sort of hacking operations that I know about for the Russian government is sort of mid-90s. So, we're 20 years into them hacking. Traditionally, governments that have very expensive hacking tools, that have very sophisticated use of exploits, they're much more worried about getting caught, because when you get caught, you have to rebuild, right? So in the event that I spend $10 million on all of this infrastructure, all of this capability, and then you discover it, then I have to spend another $10 million to, get some more. And what we've really seen in the past few years with the Russian sort of hacking, and increasingly with other countries as well, is that they're really going to very cheap tools, right? Things like phishing. Phishing is, you don't need to spend, millions of dollars on zero-day vulnerabilities, on having all of these complicated bits of infrastructure. This is just a website somewhere. It just looks really like the Google website. It clearly works, and so because it's very cheap, there's actually very low consequences of getting caught. And so we've definitely seen a shift where they care much less about getting caught, and they're just very aggressively going after everyone, because there's no comeback, right? The US might get very angry, they might send some very angry emails to them, but at the end of the day, they got a significant foreign policy achievement out of this at the US's expense, and very little comeback has happened.
So it's less about, relations and PR and more about cost.
Yeah, so in the event that, we had a very friendly relationship with, take Germany, for instance, right? In the event that Germany decided to do this, then we would get a very significant souring of relations with Germany off the back of it. They might say it's not worth it, right? Whereas with Russia, because we have such a bad relationship with them at the moment, in the event that they just hack everybody, do they honestly care? We're going to be slightly more mad than we were before. Who cares, right? Yep.
So because the president says this is fake news and that the Russian stuff is false, who's driving the attempt to beef up our security? I mean, it has to come from the top down. So is it private industry that's going to be trying to work things out for us?
So yeah, it definitely, when it comes to these different areas, when it comes to defending against hacks, there's lots of private sector involvement in defending customers against their accounts being hacked. We've seen companies like Google have been very proactive in trying to build in defenses to make it harder for people to get hacked and more obvious when people are trying to hack people. So, for instance, my account is the target of some countries, and so every time I log into Gmail, at the top it says, by the way, you need to, enable all of these extra security features. And whenever they come up with a new security feature, I get sort of a notification that this is happening, and that's them being proactive for their customers. When it comes to things like defending the media, I think has come to a series of conclusions about how they made mistakes in the run-up to the election. They're trying to correct for it. Whether those are good or bad, I think, depends on various things. When it comes to things like having a direct response, that's ultimately a foreign policy issue for the United States. The president controls foreign policy. In the event that the president wants to say, we're not going to have a response to this, which appears to be his position, then there is no deterrence there, right? The Russian government did this thing. The United States has taken as a policy position that was fine, we're fine with that. And that really damages deterrence internationally. It really damages our allies who see Russian influence and they say, this is not okay, we want to have this norm of deterrence. But that's ultimately a foreign policy decision of the United States. Yep.
So next question I have to ask is, so we're also hearing the stories that they actually allegedly hacked into our actual election system at the local level. Why do you think they did that if, your supposition on the other side, which is that they were just coming here to divide us? And is that just another part of that metric of coming to divide us, just panic us all that, our voting machines have been hacked? And that's just another way of, putting that level of fear into us.
So yeah, I think it's both of those things. So first of all, there's a lot of stories about how the Russian government affected votes in terms of hacking the electoral system itself, which for the most part are not actually what the technical details show us, right? The technical details show us that there were some very basic preliminary scans of some of these electoral systems. It's not very clear that some of the attacks that were successful there were actually from the Russian government. A lot of people assume they were because they happened at the time that all of this was going on. I think we have to be quite careful with some of these claims that they're being beefed up for partisan reasons. But it's definitely the case that in the immediate prefix to the election that there was a concerted effort to discredit the integrity of the vote, which isn't the same as saying that they actually, compromise votes, but they recognize that after the election, Donald Trump is going to have all of his supporters who are going to say this was rigged by Director Comey, by Hillary Clinton, by all of the establishment, right? This was all a big rigged election. Having a couple of examples where you could point to and say, oh, maybe you shouldn't trust, this particular county's election machines. Maybe you shouldn't trust, that particular voter registration database. Those things massively amplify those concerns, and then those people will believe that they've been disenfranchised, then you're causing divisions inside the United States, which is ultimately their goal. Yep.
So this question presupposes that you have information or some knowledge about the French hacking that occurred right before the blackout period. But I'd be really curious to get your perspective in comparing and contrasting both the method of hacking and how that was or was not similar to what happened with DNC or Trump Desta, but also how Macron's campaign handled that.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting that, we've got the United States election, we've got the French election, we've got the German election as well. And the Russian government had an interest in all three of these elections, but actually quite different strategies for them. In the US election, obviously, it was, I don't need to tell this audience, but with the French election, they compromised Macron's party internal emails from a couple of people. I think the best theory at the moment is that was by phishing. Unlike John Podesta, they didn't have the phishing email itself in the leak. Presumably that's because they've learned from their mistakes. One of the things that was very interesting about it is that there is this, I think it's a 48-hour period blackout prior to the election. They leaked this email at about 49, 50 hours or so before the election, because they realize that they get 2 hours of panic by everybody, in which everybody says, oh my goodness, Macron's emails have been leaked, and then nobody can report on them for 2 days, and then there's the election. And I think they really were trying to exploit that sort of blackout period. I think it backfired on a couple of reasons. I think, number one, there just really wasn't enough time for people to go through those emails to try and find things that were interesting. I think also they underestimated how much the media, sort of the traditional media rather than just social media, actually has an impact in influencing what people are aware of prior to an election. I think also in the aftermath of the US election, lots of people were very much on edge as to whether or not this was not, some self-interested French national who really wanted to show this corruption by Macron, but actually was a directed influence campaign by a foreign government. And if it is, maybe we shouldn't help them by reading it. So I think that was an interesting difference. And it was very interesting to see with the German election that they really haven't gone down the sort of massive influence campaign. Lots of people expected them to. That really didn't materialize. And I think that the media has a lot to do with that. The media was very sort of expecting it to happen and ramping up for when it happens, it's going to be quite anti-Russian. And I think the Russian government took the position that it would be counterproductive. Yep. It's been enormously successful to them. If I was a colonel in the GRU, I would be asking for a massive budget increase, and I don't think that they would be denied it. One thing that I do think is very easy, I think, for us to assume that they know what was happening. I think it's very easy for us to assume they had a better sort of model of US politics, a better sort of understanding as to what was going on, and it was very sort of planned. And I think actually the evidence is that they're very good at being agile. They're very good at evolving quickly. And so I suspect that they are going to continue, at least when there's no consequences of them not continuing, why not?
Is that going to be Brexit?
So we did see some influence in Brexit. It was quite a different style.
Moving forward, given that Brexit's now really heading in such a critical state, and you see that the UK government is flat-footed and Boris Johnson and everything else, but you currently have slightly the upper hand, so would that be another thing to come in?
Yeah, so they're quite good at choosing their opportunities, their times. As you know, they know exactly when to release. They're quite good at planning that. So what you might see with Brexit, you have the 2-year clock. You might see when it gets quite close to the wire that they realise that actually now is a great time to be very disruptive. And they definitely do have a sort of concerted position that the European Union and the United Kingdom are not part of Russians' friends. So anything that you can do to disrupt that, I think they would see as generally good.
So would NAFTA fall in that too, with NAFTA negotiations there?
I don't know enough about NAFTA to really talk. Any other questions? Nope.